Flash will arrive before the sound, before the pressure wave, before your brain fully registers that the world has just changed. A nuclear detonation does not begin with chaos, it begins with physics. In the first milliseconds, a sphere of energy hotter than the surface of the sun expands outward, releasing an intense burst of thermal radiation and ionizing energy that travels faster than any human reaction time. If you are exposed in direct line of sight, the damage is immediate and irreversible. But most people will not be at ground zero. Most people will be somewhere in the gradient between survivable and fatal, and that narrow margin is where this 48-hour protocol exists. The danger is not just the explosion, it is the sequence. The blast wave follows, compressing air into a wall of pressure capable of collapsing structures and turning debris into high-velocity projectiles. Then comes the fallout, the invisible phase that lingers, settles, and poisons the environment. Survival is not about enduring one event, it is about navigating a chain reaction of physical processes that unfold over hours and days. The critical misunderstanding is that nuclear survival is only for those with bunkers, that without reinforced underground shelters, the outcome is predetermined. That assumption is not only incorrect, it is deadly. The hidden science begins with radiation attenuation and time decay. Fallout radiation is not constant, it decreases rapidly following a predictable pattern. The most dangerous period is the first 24 to 48 hours, where radiation intensity can drop by up to 90%. This is not guesswork, it is based on the well-documented 710 rule of radioactive decay, where for every sevenfold increase in time, radiation exposure decreases by a factor of 10. This means that if radiation is lethal at 1 hour after detonation, it becomes significantly less dangerous after 7 hours and dramatically reduced after 49 hours. This window defines your survival strategy. The evidence comes from both historical testing data and modern nuclear emergency planning models. After the detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, individuals who found shelter behind dense materials, concrete, earth, even thick walls, experienced significantly lower radiation exposure compared to those in open areas. In controlled tests, even improvised shielding reduced gamma radiation intensity by measurable margins. The implication is clear: survival is not binary. It is incremental. Every layer of protection, every minute of delayed exposure, every decision to move or stay can shift the outcome. The first phase of the 48-hour protocol begins at the moment of detonation or warning. If you see a flash, you do not look, you act. The immediate response is to drop, cover exposed skin, and move away from windows. Glass becomes shrapnel under blast pressure, and even at distances where buildings remain standing, window failure is nearly universal. The difference between minor injury and fatal trauma often comes down to positioning in these first seconds. If you are indoors, you stay indoors. If you are outdoors, you move to the nearest substantial structure immediately. Vehicles do not count. They offer no meaningful protection against radiation or blast effects. The escalation occurs as fallout begins to descend. Within minutes to hours, depending on wind patterns and distance from the detonation, radioactive particles will begin to settle. These particles are not just dust, they are fragments of fission products, emitting gamma radiation that penetrates the body and damages cells at a molecular level. The misconception is that radiation is something you can feel or see. In reality, it is silent, invisible, and cumulative. By the time symptoms appear, exposure has already occurred. The hidden principle here is shielding and distance. Radiation intensity decreases with both increased distance from the source and increased density of material between you and the source. This is why basements are significantly safer than upper floors, and why interior rooms without windows offer better protection than perimeter spaces. Even without a bunker, a standard building can provide substantial shielding if used correctly. Concrete, brick, and earth are effective barriers. Wood and drywall are less effective but still offer some reduction. The key is layering, placing as much mass as possible between you and the outside environment. Evidence from Cold War-era civil defense studies shows that improvised shelters within ordinary homes could reduce radiation exposure by factors of 10 or more. This is not theoretical. It is based on measured attenuation coefficients and real-world testing. The survival implication is that your environment, even if not designed for nuclear protection, can be adapted in real time to increase your chances of survival. This is the core of the no-bunker strategy. As the first hour passes, the situation stabilizes externally but becomes more dangerous internally. Fires may ignite, infrastructure may fail, and communication networks may collapse. The instinct to flee becomes overwhelming, but this is the most dangerous decision point. Leaving shelter during active fallout dramatically increases exposure. The escalation here is psychological, panic overriding physics. The correct action is counterintuitive: you stay put. The transition into the next phase is defined by time. The first 6 to 12 hours are the most critical for minimizing radiation exposure. During this period, you must remain in the most protected area available, avoid contact with external surfaces, and begin managing internal resources. Water, air, and contamination control become the new priorities. The environment outside is not just hazardous, it is actively degrading. The longer you delay exposure, the safer eventual movement becomes. But this is where another misunderstanding emerges, that survival is simply about waiting. In reality, it is about controlled adaptation. Air circulation, for example, becomes a critical factor. Completely sealing a space can lead to carbon dioxide buildup, especially in smaller rooms. The hidden science involves balancing ventilation with contamination risk. Small, controlled airflow through filtered or indirect pathways can maintain breathable air without significantly increasing radiation exposure. This is not about comfort, it is about maintaining physiological stability. The evidence for this comes from confined space studies and emergency shelter design principles, where air exchange rates are carefully calculated to prevent suffocation while minimizing external contamination. The implication is that even in improvised conditions, basic principles of airflow and filtration can be applied. Cloth barriers, layered materials, and indirect ventilation paths can reduce particulate entry while allowing necessary air movement. As the hours progress, the external radiation levels begin to decline, but the internal challenge intensifies. Food and water safety become critical. Fallout particles can contaminate open sources, and ingestion of radioactive material introduces internal exposure pathways that are far more dangerous than external radiation. The misconception is that all water becomes unsafe. In reality, sealed containers, deep groundwater, and protected supplies remain viable. The hidden principle is contamination control, preventing particles from entering your body. Evidence from nuclear incident response protocols shows that simple measures, such as covering containers, avoiding open collection during fallout, and using stored supplies, can significantly reduce ingestion risk. The survival implication is that preparation is not just about stockpiling, but about understanding how to protect what you have. The escalation continues as the first 24 hours approach. Fatigue, stress, and uncertainty begin to degrade decision-making. This is where the protocol becomes most critical. Every action must be deliberate, every movement calculated. The environment is still dangerous, but it is becoming less so. The difference between survival and exposure is now measured in timing. And as the second day begins, the world outside has changed in ways that are not immediately visible. The radiation has decreased, but it has not disappeared. The infrastructure may be compromised, and the path forward is uncertain. The next phase is not about enduring, it is about transitioning from shelter to movement, from isolation to navigation. But that transition must be precise because the margin for error is still razor thin. The transition out of shelter is the most misunderstood and most dangerous phase of the entire timeline, because it feels like the moment of relief when in reality it is the moment of exposure. By the time 48 hours have passed, radiation levels in most fallout scenarios will have dropped significantly, but lower does not mean safe. It means survivable under controlled conditions. The danger now is no longer the immediate lethal dose delivered in minutes. It is the cumulative dose delivered over hours as you move through an environment that is still contaminated. This is where discipline replaces instinct, and where small decisions begin to compound into long-term survival or delayed consequences. The analysis begins with understanding residual radiation distribution. Fallout is not evenly spread. It concentrates in low-lying areas, on rooftops and drainage systems, and along surfaces where particles can settle and remain undisturbed. Wind patterns during and after detonation create irregular zones of higher contamination, sometimes forming narrow but highly radioactive corridors extending far beyond the initial blast radius. The misunderstanding is assuming that distance from the explosion equals safety. In reality, a location farther away but directly downwind can be more hazardous than a closer location outside the primary fallout path. The hidden science here is particle behavior and decay chains. Fallout particles vary in size, and their settling speed determines how far they travel. Larger particles fall quickly and contaminate areas near the detonation site, while smaller particles can remain suspended and travel long distances before settling. Each particle carries unstable isotopes that decay over time, emitting radiation in the process. The intensity of that emission decreases predictably, but not uniformly. Some isotopes decay rapidly, contributing to the steep drop in radiation during the first 48 hours, while others persist longer, creating a lingering background hazard. This layered decay is why timing matters more than distance alone. Evidence from atmospheric nuclear testing and modern simulation models, shows that individuals who delayed evacuation until after the initial decay period experienced significantly lower total radiation exposure compared to those who fled immediately. The implication is counterintuitive but critical. Staying sheltered for longer, even in imperfect conditions, often results in a better survival outcome than early movement through a contaminated environment. This principle directly contradicts the instinct to escape as soon as possible, which is why it must be understood before the moment arrives. The survival implication now shifts toward controlled exit. Before leaving shelter, decontamination within the shelter environment becomes essential. Any clothing worn during the initial exposure phase may carry radioactive particles. Removing outer layers and sealing them away reduces ongoing exposure. Skin contamination, particularly on hands, face, and hair, must be addressed with whatever clean water is available. The goal is not perfect cleanliness, it is reduction. Even partial removal of particles can significantly decrease radiation dose over time. The misunderstanding is that decontamination requires specialized equipment. In reality, basic hygiene principles, removal, isolation, and rinsing, provide measurable benefits. As movement begins, the escalation becomes environmental. The outside world may appear unchanged in structure but altered in function. Roads may be blocked, communication networks silent, and emergency services overwhelmed or non-existent. Navigation is no longer about convenience, it is about minimizing exposure. Time spent outdoors must be reduced to the absolute minimum necessary to reach a safer location or more sustainable shelter. This introduces the principle of exposure budgeting. Every minute outside consumes part of a finite safety margin. The hidden science guiding this phase is inverse square law and shielding optimization. Radiation intensity decreases rapidly with distance from a source, but when the source is distributed across surfaces, distance alone is insufficient. Instead, microenvironments become critical. Walking along the center of a street may expose you to more radiation than moving close to a solid wall that blocks radiation from one direction. Entering structures intermittently, even briefly, can reduce cumulative exposure by providing temporary shielding. The environment becomes a landscape of gradients rather than a uniform field. Evidence from radiation safety protocols in contaminated zones demonstrates that route selection and movement patterns can reduce exposure by significant margins without increasing travel time dramatically. The implication is that awareness of surroundings, identifying dense materials, avoiding visibly dusty or undisturbed areas, and minimizing contact with surfaces directly influences survival probability. This is not about speed, it is about efficiency under constraint. Water and food acquisition now re-enter the equation under stricter conditions. The misunderstanding at this stage is that scarcity overrides safety. Consuming contaminated resources introduces internal exposure that continues long after external exposure has ended. The hidden principle is selectivity. Sealed, packaged, or previously stored items remain the safest options. Surface contamination on containers can be wiped or rinsed, reducing risk before consumption. Open water sources, especially those exposed during fallout, carry higher risk unless treated or filtered in ways that remove particulate matter. The evidence supporting this comes from post-incident analyses, where ingestion pathways contributed significantly to long-term radiation dose in affected populations. The survival implication is that restraint, choosing not to consume questionable resources, can be as important as finding resources at all. Hunger and thirst develop over time. Radiation damage from ingestion begins immediately at the cellular level. As the hours extend beyond the initial 48-hour window, the escalation transitions from acute survival to sustained adaptation. The environment is no longer rapidly changing, but it remains compromised. Infrastructure damage may limit access to clean water, medical care, and reliable information. The misunderstanding here is expecting a rapid return to normalcy. In reality, recovery timelines depend on the scale of the event, and in many scenarios, self-sufficiency becomes necessary for extended periods. The hidden science now involves cumulative dose management. Radiation exposure is not a single event but an accumulation over time. Each additional exposure adds to the total dose, increasing the risk of long-term health effects. The goal shifts from avoidance to minimization, reducing daily exposure as much as possible while maintaining essential activities. This includes choosing living spaces with better shielding, limiting time in high-risk areas, and maintaining decontamination routines. Evidence from occupational radiation safety standards shows that even small reductions in daily exposure can significantly impact total dose over weeks and months. The implication is that survival is not defined solely by the first 48 hours, but by the habits established during that period. The protocol is not just a response, it is a foundation for ongoing decision-making. The final transition is psychological. The initial shock has passed, the immediate danger has been navigated, but uncertainty remains. This is where discipline must persist without the urgency that first created it. The human tendency is to relax precautions as visible danger decreases, but radiation does not signal its presence. The misunderstanding is equating calm with safety. The hidden principle is consistency, maintaining protective behaviors even when they feel unnecessary. In the end, the absence of a bunker does not define the outcome. What defines it is the ability to interpret a hostile environment through the lens of physics, to act against instinct when instinct is misaligned with reality, and to apply simple, evidence-based principles under extreme conditions. Survival is not granted by equipment alone, it is constructed through understanding, timing, and control. The flash, the blast, the fallout, these are events governed by immutable laws. But within those laws exists a narrow, precise path where survival remains possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but achievable. And in that narrow margin, knowledge becomes structure, discipline becomes shelter, and time itself becomes the most critical resource you have.